What's your paranormal encounters in the attic, basement or crawl spaces? I was taught ghosts weren't real. My mother and father laughed off any mention of the paranormal and called people who believed crazy. I was proud to be the kid in my friend group who wasn't afraid of ghosts or spooky stories. It never crossed my mind that they could be true because everything had an explanation. We moved into an old Victorian house in the PNW in the early 2000s. The house had been built over 100 years ago in a small lumber town. It was beautiful and a fixer-upper. It had a real crystal chandelier, stained glass windows, a dilapidated clawfoot tub in the basement, and was falling apart in places. My parents were determined to patch it up over time. One place they never got around to was the basement. Being down there gave you the feeling. It hadn't changed much since the house was first built a century ago. Welcoming is not a word I would use to describe it. There was always a sense of being watched. It was dark and dingy. The only light was a single bare bulb in the support beams. Not even the adults could stand being down there for long. I caught my mom running up the basement stairs a few times and quickly shutting the door behind her like something scared her. When I asked what was wrong, she would pretend she was fine. I would learn years later that both of my parents were terrified of the basement without being able to pinpoint why. It became a storage space. Odd things happened in the house that I made up reasons for. My little brother and my doors faced each other on the second floor. One night, we both heard a shrieking sound outside our doors like a woman was being killed in the hallway. We opened our doors at the same time and confirmed we both heard it. I told him it was probably just cats fighting outside. I went back to bed where I tried to convince myself it was just cats. Except, why would the sounds come from the hall and not from outside our windows? We didn't have pets either. Another night, I was staying up past my bedtime to read under the covers with a flashlight. My bed began to shake violently. I thought it was an earthquake. I had already been through one that was a 6.8 magnitude, so I held on and waited it out. When it subsided, I ran to the living room where my father was. I asked if he felt the earthquake. He hadn't felt a thing. That was concerning, so I pressed him. He told me it must have been a large truck passing by. So I returned to my room and tried to convince myself that's all it was. The incident that I could not explain happened shortly before we moved out. I was asked to retrieve something from the basement for my mother. I begrudgingly obliged, it still gave me the creeps. So I went down, pretending to not feel the oppressive energy that hung over the room. As I was searching through a box, I felt an overwhelming sensation that something was telling me to look up. It felt important. So I did. My eyes went up to a shelf across the room. There was a row of large spools of ribbon my mother used for presents. They had sturdy circular bases around 4 inches in diameter if I had to estimate. It would take something more than wind or shaking from a large vehicle to do what I saw next. I will never forget this moment because it made me question my perception reality for the first time in my life. It was dead quiet as I watched one of the spools slowly tip over onto its side and roll off the shelf. I could barely comprehend what I had just seen, and I wasn't going to find out if ghosts were real by sticking around. I flew up the stairs and took a walk to my friend's house. I told no one about it until I was in my 20s. I didn't think anyone would take me seriously. Surprisingly, all these years later, my parents believe me. There was something about that house. I grew up in a small-ish house, not terribly old compared to some area homes built in 1950. However, my sisters and I had so many unexplained things happen. We'd always try to tell our parents, but it was always played off as the vents popping or other weird excuses. But when we finally moved out, I was around 12, my dad admitted that there was definitely something going on in the house. I have way too many stories to share in one post. Dog barking down the hallway towards the basement, cat howling and pawing at the basement wall, lights going out on their own, repeated nightmares and dreams that only occurred in the house, noises in the middle of the night, etc. Each of us had seen at least something at one point or another. One sister saw a shadow of a tall man wearing a hat come out of the closet one night, walk to her bed and knelt beside it, and she could hear him praying. She screamed for my parents after that one. Both her and I had seen small goblin-looking creatures. I can only compare their shape and movements to E.T. They would walk in a line around my parents' bedroom at night. If you went in when it was dark, you'd see them come out from the back area of the room, walk around the bed, and disappear at the doorway. I had a nightmare one night and was going to my parents' room, which required me walking past the basement door, where I believed the entity resided most of the time, and the door was open. When I passed, there was a figure that stood down a few steps but was as tall as the door and had a very large oval-shaped head. I could see its face. The eyes were huge and it was smiling and looking down at me. All I could do was run back to my room until I could buck up the courage to run up, shut the door, and run past. Every night when I would get in bed, the hall light would still be on, parents still awake and all. I would feel hands press down on the bottom portion of my bed and almost walk up the bed to about my knees and stop. If the entity was a praying one, like my sister encountered one night, looking back, I'm wondering if it wasn't stopping in for a nightly prayer before bedtime. Regardless, not something I would want repeated again. For a while, I thought maybe it was my comforter settling on my legs, but I remember always trying to recreate the feeling when I'd be sleeping over at friends' houses or elsewhere, and I could never recreate it, so it was definitely something else. The one incident that sticks out to me the most though is the footsteps. So, I got used to waking up like clockwork every night at midnight. Everyone was asleep, and I could hear footsteps coming up the basement stairs. Again, nightly. The basement door was near my room. There was a small hallway that basically ran along where the stairs went down, so I was fairly close. Typically, once they reached the top, I wouldn't hear them anymore, and that would be it. One night, however, I woke up and heard them come up the stairs, but they continued around the corner, and I could hear them come to my door. My door was shut, so I just laid there under the covers, thinking that was the end of it, but then I heard them start again, inside my room. They walked up and stopped right next to my bed. At that point, I was way too terrified to look and just stayed under the covers. I didn't hear anything else, so for all I know, this thing just stood there and watched me. I ended up falling asleep, somehow, again, but I remember being terrified, just waiting for something to happen. I think of that house often and now that I'm older, wish I knew more about the background and what may have happened there, or on the land around it, based on one of the consistent dreams I had, or who the original owner was. I always want to somehow get in touch with the people who live there now, as I believe it's still the people that bought it from us, and see if they've had any encounters or stories. I still don't know if it was a friendly entity that just didn't do the best at interacting with children, or if it was something more sinister. There's things that happened that honestly could point in both directions for me. The house definitely made me a believer, and I've experienced paranormal things in other locations throughout my life, but the consistency that always happened in the house I grew up in will always be something that sticks with me. Alright, so it's the summer going into my 8th grade year, 5 years ago roughly, so I fell into a late sleeping schedule, usually falling asleep around 4-ish in the AM, and I was hanging out with my friend in my room, which is in the basement. We were listening to some Johnny Cash around 3 AM trying to sleep when all of a sudden, this huge bang hit my bedroom door. The best way I can describe the sound is a ball of some sort getting thrown full speed right at my door. My friend and I both become paralyzed with fear, and he looks at me and says, "Dude, I just saw a shadow pass through the cracks of your door." My door didn't take up the entire hallway of my room, and there were 2 wood planks to fill space, so I knew exactly what he was talking about. After a solid 30 to 45 seconds of just sitting there scared as heck, we both decide to check this thing out. We grab weapons and open the door to find nothing. Of course, and we go up to talk to my family. One brother's away at college. My brother, mother and other brother are away at my brother's baseball tourney, and only my dad and sister are home. They say they heard or saw nothing, and here I am today, still clueless as to what happened. One theory I had is that my friend's a jerk and did it, but I'm next to positive he didn't because he would have eventually told me. And something else odd that occurred was, I was playing my drums, a decent time often, the original event, with my door open, and as I looked up and to my left, I swear I saw a little black flash exit my vision nearly immediately after looking up. Similar to looking away as somebody looks at you. My wife and I purchased our first home recently. We finally moved in after a bout with title issues. It belonged to an elderly couple, of which the last person to pass away was the husband of cancer. The wife also died of cancer, and based on the hospice stuff we saw, I believe at least the husband passed here. It is an older home but very well maintained. Upon moving in, there was a table in the basement spare room, used to be a spare bedroom it seems. The husband worked for a furniture company, so it stands to reason he made it considering the workshop downstairs. My wife wanted it for her computer desk, so we moved it upstairs. The following night, my wife was up late and went past the table. She swears she heard a male voice say something to her and felt a gust of wind shortly after. Of course, she turned and saw nothing there. She told me of this the next day, but I chalked it up to not being comfortable here yet. Even though she's not a massive believer in the paranormal, she's not one to make up extravagant stories. A couple of days later, I was moving some equipment to the basement that will become a game room. The wife and children were upstairs. I sat down a box and heard a male's voice, seemingly almost directly behind me near my right ear. What was said couldn't be discerned, but I spun around and saw only the basement wall. We aren't near neighbors and it didn't come from upstairs. Another evening, I was out on the deck late at night and heard a slam from the basement. Being a new homeowner and despite the home being well maintained, I feared the water heater went out or something. I went downstairs to the basement and found nothing amiss, save for the guest bedroom door being shut. It wasn't shut by me, nor did my wife do it. She was moving stuff in there for a classroom. The children did not go down there. It is the same room where that table was located. The final incident for me was putting up a decoration in the game room. I had a candle my mother had given us in a metal container with a lid on the other side. It hadn't been used yet. As I began to screw in the decoration, I heard a clang. I turned around and the lid was on the ground 6 feet from the candle. I suppose it could have fallen, but that's far too full, and I'm certain it was on securely. The last thing is while I was at work, my wife was unpacking in the living room and saw a shadow out of her corner vision heading down the hall towards the table. She went out to look thinking it was the children, but they were in their room playing a video game. We've had no incidents since, and I suppose it could all be coincidental, but if it is him, I don't sense maliciousness. He was seemingly well loved around here. I've always loved the paranormal. I grew up in a haunted house and grew to become comfortable with it. However, the last 2 weeks have been odd, and I have been trying to debunk these experiences before I start to think we have a ghostly visitor. It started 2 weeks ago with heavy footsteps. My family lives in a larger home and it has 3 flights of stairs. I heard the steps coming up from my basement and headed towards my bedroom on the top floor. I looked to see if it was my husband or son coming up to see me, but, alas, no one was there. I didn't mention it to my husband or kids. Then my 2 daughters came to me a few days later saying they also heard the same footsteps. Here's where it gets fun. Around 4 a.m. last week, I was laying in bed sleeping. I knew it was 4-ish because that's when my husband gets up for work. 2 very cold hands grabbed my ankles and yanked me down the bed. This obviously woke me up. I waited till my husband got out of the shower and asked him why he was pulling on my feet. He insisted he didn't. Annoyed, I asked again why he was yanking my feet. Again, he said he hadn't because he had been in the shower. That's when I started worrying. I later found bruises on both my ankles after he left. I stayed awake. I watched him get into his truck and drive off. I was at the top of my bedroom steps when I heard a loud slam in the basement. I recognized the sound as my washing machine door, which we keep open when not in use. I went down to check it out and it was closed. Since then, food has been flung from plates, pictures thrown off walls, game DVDs being thrown across rooms, dresser drawers being opened, and banging and voices in our garage.